In the early 1950s, the freezing skies over Mig Alley in Korea became the ultimate proving ground for the very first generation of jet fighters. At the absolute center of this high-stakes aerial theater was the North American F-86 Sabre. With its sleek, swept-wing design and combat-proven reliability, the Sabre quickly became the undisputed star of the Western world's military arsenal. It was the phenomenal plane that gave Allied pilots the decisive edge they desperately needed to perfectly match the Soviet-built MiG-15's deadly, swirling dogfights at 40,000 feet. For the United States military, the remarkable F-86 was not simply just another fighter aircraft entering the fleet. It was a soaring symbol of sheer technological dominance that effectively dictated the uncompromising terms of high-altitude aerial warfare. American commanders loudly proclaimed that the Sabre was the ultimate guardian of the free world skies. Yet, while the Americans comfortably celebrated their remarkable engineering triumph, observant military strategists situated halfway across the globe were meticulously studying these ferocious aerial engagements, silently extracting vital lessons that would eventually alter aviation history forever. Down in the distant southern hemisphere, the Royal Australian Air Force was intently watching the brutal Korean conflict unfold with profound, intense interest. Australia suddenly found itself standing at a highly critical strategic crossroads in a rapidly evolving geopolitical landscape. Their current frontline jet, the venerable British Gloucester Meteor, was undeniably already showing its significant age. It was simply outmatched against the much faster and significantly more agile swept-wing MiGs dominating the Asian skies. A senior commander noted grimly that sending Meteors against MiGs was essentially asking brave men to die. To adequately protect its vast, sprawling borders and successfully fulfill its vital military obligations in the increasingly volatile Southeast Asia region, Australia absolutely needed a formidable world beater. They urgently required a superior fighter that could completely dominate the hostile sky for the next entire decade. The immense pressure to quickly modernize the nation's aging aerial fleet weighed heavily upon the highest echelons of defense leadership. The harsh reality of the terrifying Cold War demanded nothing short of absolute aerial supremacy to maintain peace and forcefully deter any potential regional aggression. The most logical, cost-effective choice for the government would have been to simply buy the standard American F-86F directly off the shelf. It was an already proven, highly successful platform. The logistics and supply chains were firmly established, and the aircraft was completely ready for immediate international delivery. Purchasing American jets would have solved the immediate defensive crisis with minimal domestic effort. However, the relentlessly ambitious Australians harbored a vastly different, far more complex vision for their future. They stubbornly refused to settle for merely acquiring a great airplane. The visionary engineers did not just want to buy a great airplane, they fiercely wanted to build the absolute best possible version of that exact airplane. The Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, firmly based in the bustling industrial heart of Melbourne, dramatically proposed a strategic move that was viewed as arrogant as it was breathtakingly ambitious. The brilliant local engineers firmly stated they would deliberately take the universally revered American aviation legend and completely re-engineer it from the inside out, totally ignoring the standard operating procedures of conventional military procurement. The controversial, high-risk decision to license-build the modified Sabre locally in Australia was never truly about saving the government money. In fact, it was fundamentally about asserting fierce national pride and demonstrating unparalleled engineering excellence on a global stage. The dedicated CAC engineers closely looked at the complex American blueprints and immediately saw massive, thrilling potential that had not yet been fully tapped by the original designers. They fundamentally believed that the standard American airframe was merely an excellent blank canvas patiently waiting for a true stroke of mechanical genius. While the massively successful, mass-produced US-built Sabres were reliably powered by the standard General Electric J47 engine, the ambitious Australians were already eyeing a completely different mechanical heart. They meticulously researched a stunningly powerful British alternative that promised to radically transform the elegant Sabre from a swift thoroughbred into an utterly terrifying, unstoppable monster. This pivotal, daring choice marked the dramatic birth of an incredibly complex project that would inevitably push the entirety of Australian aerospace engineering capabilities to their absolute, unforgiving limits. The RAAF leadership was fiercely determined and simply wasn't interested in forever remaining a subservient junior partner to the colossal American military-industrial complex. The seasoned Australian pilots and brilliant engineers collaboratively wanted an exceptional fighter jet that could easily outclimb, thoroughly outrun, and massively outgun anything the Americans were currently flying at that specific time. An ambitious lead designer confidently told his skeptical team that they were going to systematically rewrite the strict rules of modern aerial warfare, boldly transforming a borrowed blueprint into an unstoppable apex predator. As the very first massive crates containing the incredibly detailed technical blueprints finally arrived at the heavily guarded facility in Melbourne, the highly motivated team at CAC immediately began a radical, uncompromising process of total Australianization. They fiercely scrutinized every single rivet, carefully evaluating exactly how the established American design could be ruthlessly optimized for unparalleled extreme performance. This was certainly not merely a routine licensed assembly job. It was essentially a highly classified declaration of absolute technological independence from traditional Allied defense manufacturing constraints. The dedicated Australian engineering team knew that, to forcefully accommodate their wildly ambitious, unprecedented upgrades, they had to fundamentally alter the very core DNA of the famous fighter jet. They enthusiastically ripped apart the elegant existing design schematics, aggressively discarding long-established engineering conventions in their relentless, unwavering pursuit of absolute aerodynamic perfection. Every single structural component was rigorously reevaluated, thoroughly tested, and deliberately pushed far beyond its original theoretical limits to ensure the newly envisioned aircraft could successfully handle the unimaginable, raw power they intended to violently unleash. This incredibly meticulous, highly stressful process of constant redesign eventually resulted in a revolutionary combat plane so extensively and fundamentally modified that only about 40% of the original American airframe actually remained physically intact. The completely stunned American technical liaisons watching the audacious project unfold in Melbourne simply could not believe the sheer scale of the profound structural alterations being confidently implemented. The relentlessly driven Australian engineers were practically building an entirely new, highly advanced interceptor while cleverly hiding it beneath the deceptively familiar skin of a standard Sabre. The immense, imposing shadow of the original American F-86 Sabre was undeniably large across the global aviation landscape, but the relentlessly innovative Australians were finally about to boldly step out from completely under it. They were actively preparing to introduce an astonishing, devastatingly powerful masterpiece of their very own creation to the fiercely competitive world. The brilliant, high-stakes decision to drastically improve the iconic Sabre was certainly one magnificent thing in theory, but the flawless, practical execution of this grand vision was a truly monumental, incredibly perilous engineering gamble. The looming critical question constantly echoed through the noisy drafting rooms of the Melbourne facility. Could this highly experimental, radically altered hybrid aircraft actually perform the seemingly impossible tasks demanded of it? The immense pressure to successfully deliver a flawless, world-beating machine weighed incredibly heavily on every single technician and brilliant designer involved in the highly classified endeavor. They intuitively knew that one single, tiny structural miscalculation could instantly result in absolute, fiery, catastrophic failure, permanently destroying both the highly valuable prototype and their fiercely protected national pride. The highly anticipated, deeply guarded secret sauce that the clever Australians boldly proposed was the complete, uncompromising replacement of the standard American engine with a vastly superior, undeniably terrifying British powerhouse. The ambitious engineers essentially decided to forcefully graft the massive, thundering heart of a heavy bomber directly into the famously slender, elegant body of a nimble interceptor. This spectacularly audacious, highly controversial structural modification firmly set the dramatic stage for the most complex, profoundly difficult aviation engineering challenge the ambitious southern nation had ever bravely dared to aggressively undertake. To fully understand the immense, staggering scale of this wildly unprecedented technical endeavor, one must carefully look at the strictly unforgiving, highly demanding physical constraints of early jet aviation design. The brilliant original American engineers had purposefully built the slender F-86 to perfectly tightly wrap around its specific, relatively compact General Electric power plant, intentionally leaving absolutely no wasted internal space whatsoever. Consequently, attempting to forcefully shove a substantially larger, significantly more powerful foreign turbine into that flawlessly optimized, tightly packed fuselage was widely considered practically impossible by most global experts. Despite the overwhelming, incredibly daunting chorus of international skepticism, loudly warning against such a highly risky, seemingly foolish modification, the fiercely stubborn CAC design team aggressively pushed forward with unyielding, absolute resolve. They cleverly utilized their remarkably extensive, deeply practical wartime experience in rapid aviation manufacturing to systematically solve the cascading, highly complex aerodynamic problems that constantly threatened to permanently derail the entire ambitious program. The busy factory floor in Melbourne quickly transformed into a highly secretive, incredibly tense laboratory, where the rigid, unforgiving laws of physics were being masterfully bent. The incredibly bold, profoundly historic narrative of the Avon Sabre officially began not in the vast open sky, but deeply buried within the meticulously drafted, highly complex blueprints scattered across the busy Australian drafting tables. These determined, wildly imaginative engineers were fiercely preparing to forcefully combine the undeniable, elegant aerodynamic grace of American design with the raw, utterly unbridled, thundering muscle of superior British engineering. The monumental, desperately anticipated mechanical transplant was finally meticulously planned, silently leaving the entire anxious aviation world breathlessly waiting to carefully witness the explosive, earth-shattering results. Every single late night spent heavily hunched over those brightly illuminated drafting tables firmly solidified the unshakable, profound belief that Australia possessed the necessary, unparalleled technical genius required to successfully pull off this seemingly impossible feat. The fiercely dedicated engineers rigorously calculated highly complex structural load paths, painstakingly ensuring that the famously delicate swept wings could reliably withstand the brutally intense, incredibly violent vibrations generated by a significantly heavier, vastly more powerful engine. They absolutely refused to accept any disastrous compromises, actively demanding absolute perfection from every single intricate component they so meticulously designed. Word of this spectacular, highly unusual engineering endeavor gradually began to slowly circulate throughout the tightly knit, highly secretive international defense community, rapidly generating intense, widespread curiosity and profound skepticism. Many highly decorated, fiercely experienced American generals openly questioned the sheer sanity of attempting to ruthlessly gut a perfectly proven, highly successful combat platform just to forcefully satisfy what they mistakenly perceived as foolish, arrogant Australian national pride. Yet, the fiercely determined CAC leadership resolutely ignored the loudly mocking external noise, firmly keeping their intense, laser-like focus strictly locked on the ultimate, groundbreaking objective. The brilliant Australian engineers completely understood that true, historic innovation rarely occurs within the highly comfortable, firmly established boundaries of conventional, strictly standardized military thinking. By aggressively daring to fundamentally challenge the rigid, original design parameters of the iconic Sabre, they were essentially laying the incredibly strong, unshakable foundational groundwork for an entirely new, incredibly lethal class of high-altitude interceptor. An experienced, highly respected mechanic proudly stated that they were not merely building an airplane, but were forcefully forging a terrifying, unstoppable mechanical weapon that would violently shock the entire modern world. As the final, meticulously calculated blueprints were confidently approved and rapidly sent directly to the bustling manufacturing floor, a profound, heavy sense of highly charged, electric anticipation completely enveloped the entire Melbourne facility. The incredibly complex, fiercely ambitious theoretical phase was finally officially over, immediately giving way to the brutally harsh, strictly unforgiving physical reality of cutting solid metal and forcefully binding heavy steel. The towering, intimidating shadow of the F-86 was undeniably large, but the wildly courageous Australians were finally about to boldly step out and aggressively create a devastating masterpiece. The decision to completely overhaul the Sabre was one profound thing in theoretical planning, but the actual physical execution immediately proved to be a monumental, incredibly perilous engineering gamble. The highly anticipated secret sauce that the brilliant Australians boldly proposed was the absolute replacement of the standard American General Electric J47 engine with the remarkably powerful Rolls-Royce Avon RA. 7. At that specific time, the mighty Avon genuinely represented the absolute, undisputed pinnacle of advanced British jet engine technology on the global stage. Originally designed to efficiently propel the massive, heavily armored English electric Canberra bomber, the remarkable Avon was an absolute beast of an engine. It was uniquely capable of producing significantly more raw thrust than its standard American counterpart ever could. However, this magnificent British powerhouse essentially came with a massive, incredibly complex mechanical catch. This highly advanced, exceptionally powerful turbine was absolutely never originally intended to tightly fit inside the famously slender, elegant, needle-like fuselage of a sleek interceptor like the Sabre. When the highly experienced engineers closely working at the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation finally began meticulously comparing the highly detailed American blueprints with the British engine schematics, a terrifying reality dawned. They immediately realized they absolutely weren't just looking at a relatively simple, straightforward engine swap as initially hoped. Instead, they were suddenly staring directly into the terrifying abyss of a fundamental structural crisis that deeply threatened to completely derail the entire massively ambitious, highly classified national aviation modernization program from the start. The imposing physical dimensions of the British turbine presented severe, practically insurmountable integration challenges for the dedicated team. The massive Avon engine was significantly larger in its overall diameter, completely different in its foundational structural mounting points, and required a vastly different, massively increased volume of high-pressure airflow to successfully function without stalling. To forcefully make this monstrous British heart consistently beat inside the delicate American body, the deeply frustrated CAC team had to quickly perform something completely unprecedented and dangerous. The intensely stressed engineering team eventually realized they had to masterfully execute what can really only be accurately described as radical, incredibly invasive reconstructive surgery on a beloved aviation legend. The very first major, highly complex physical hurdle they desperately needed to successfully overcome was the deeply restrictive design of the forward air intake. The magnificent Avon was an incredibly air-hungry mechanical beast, and the famously sleek, exceptionally narrow original F-86 intake was simply far too small to adequately feed it. The heavy British turbine constantly required a massive, uninterrupted flow of dense oxygen to successfully generate its incredibly massive, world-beating power output during sustained high-speed combat maneuvers. To brilliantly solve this highly critical, deeply problematic aerodynamic limitation, the famously innovative Australian engineers aggressively had to widen the distinctive nose intake significantly. This dramatic structural alteration permanently gave the resulting CAC Sabre its highly distinctive, slightly gaping frontal mouth when closely compared to the undeniably sleeker, more streamlined original American fighter version. Unfortunately for the incredibly exhausted, heavily overworked technical teams desperately laboring in the noisy Melbourne factory, the mandatory structural modifications absolutely did not simply stop at the widened nose section. Because the massive Avon engine was actually significantly shorter but vastly wider than the original American power plant, the entire densely packed internal layout of the sophisticated aircraft had to be aggressively gutted. The elegantly designed fuselage was essentially brutally split completely in two to properly accommodate the new dimensions. Furthermore, the completely different physical proportions and profoundly altered center of gravity generated by the massive new engine required incredibly drastic, highly invasive internal structural interventions. The highly stressed CAC engineering team actually had to carefully insert a completely custom-built heavy structural spacer directly into the fuselage. Consequently, they were forcefully required to meticulously redesign roughly 60% of the fighter's highly complex internal airframe structure just to ensure the newly modified aircraft would not instantly snap during high-speed flight. The highly experienced American technical observers, actively monitoring the incredibly chaotic factory floor, noted that this deeply complex process absolutely wasn't a simple kit car assembly project. This was fundamentally a complete, profoundly radical reimagining of the classic aircraft's basic aerodynamic physics and structural integrity from the ground up. Furthermore, The massive Avon engine's incredibly heavy weight and spectacularly violent power output completely necessitated a mandatory, massive overhaul of the exceptionally complex aviation fuel storage systems and vital thermal cooling ducts. To successfully balance the incredibly volatile new mechanical beast, the relentlessly determined Australians stubbornly had to aggressively move the heavy central gearbox and heavily modify the critical internal accessory drives. They painstakingly relocated the highly vulnerable, massive internal fuel tanks and heavily strengthened the delicate wing roots to safely handle the vastly increased, incredibly violent aerodynamic stresses. Sustained high-speed combat maneuvers powered by the massive British turbine would easily tear a standard, unmodified American airframe completely to tiny, unrecognizable shredded pieces. The heavily guarded manufacturing floor rapidly transformed into a terrifyingly complex jigsaw puzzle of truly epic, unprecedented mechanical proportions. Every single newly required structural piece had to be painstakingly custom machined directly in the bustling Melbourne facility to highly exacting, strictly unforgiving physical tolerances. At that specific historical time, these exceptionally demanding precision manufacturing requirements firmly stood at the absolute cutting edge of global aviation engineering, forcefully pushing the relatively small Australian industrial base far beyond its previously known absolute operational limits. Beyond the massively complicated, incredibly stressful engine integration crisis, there firmly remained the highly debated, deeply critical tactical question of the aircraft's primary offensive firepower capabilities. The brilliant original American designers had cautiously equipped the legendary Sabre with a standard battery of 6 heavy 50 caliber machine guns tightly packed into the nose. This heavily entrenched armament philosophy was essentially a direct, stubborn holdover from outdated World War II tactical thinking that heavily emphasized delivering a massive, continuous high volume of suppressive fire. However, the remarkably perceptive Australian military strategists and highly experienced combat pilots intensely looked at the bloody, rapidly evolving early lessons of the terrifying new jet age. They quickly realized that when engaging hostile targets flying at near supersonic speeds, a pilot absolutely doesn't need to fire more tiny bullets. Instead, they urgently required vastly bigger, massively more destructive projectiles to guarantee a sudden, catastrophic kill in the incredibly brief, fleeting fractions of a second they had to perfectly align their advanced targeting sights. In a deeply controversial, incredibly bold tactical decision, the confident Australians aggressively scrapped the 6 standard American machine guns completely from the newly modified airframe blueprints. They violently carved out massive amounts of precious internal space within the tightly cramped nose to carefully install 2 absolutely massive, incredibly devastating 30mm A-10 automatic cannons. This highly aggressive armament change alone instantly required a massive, exceptionally complex total redesign of the delicate forward nose bay and the critical spent brass casing ejection ports. Integrating these terrifyingly powerful British weapons presented yet another highly dangerous, completely unexpected structural crisis for the deeply exhausted manufacturing team. The exceptionally violent physical vibration and massive backward recoil generated by rapidly firing massive 30mm high explosive shells could quite literally shake a lesser, unmodified airframe completely apart in midair. To safely survive the incredibly violent shock waves of its very own weapons, the famously delicate nose section had to be massively reinforced with exceptionally heavy, strictly military-grade hardened structural skinning. The relentlessly determined engineers successfully transformed the incredibly nimble, exceptionally elegant American Interceptor from a rapidly stinging insect into a brutally devastating, incredibly heavy mechanical sledgehammer. They brilliantly solved the terrifying structural cracking issues caused by the massive ADEN cannons, finally ensuring the radically altered fuselage could consistently withstand the absolutely horrific punishment of sustained aerial combat. The meticulously redesigned aircraft was rapidly becoming an unstoppable, deeply terrifying mechanical predator that seamlessly combined elegant flight characteristics with absolute offensive violence. The incredibly demanding engineering schedule brutally forced the dedicated CAC technical teams to frequently work grueling, deeply exhausting double shifts inside the sweltering Melbourne factory complex. Their intense, unwavering national pride constantly pushed them to meticulously handcraft thousands of highly complex, entirely unique structural rivets and specialized mounting brackets required for the massive turbine. Every single heavily modified structural bulkhead was painstakingly tested under incredibly immense, terrifying hydraulic pressure to strictly ensure absolute, unwavering survivability during sustained high-speed tactical engagements. Highly critical, notoriously demanding defense inspectors from the Royal Australian Air Force constantly monitored the incredibly chaotic, heavily guarded production line with fierce, uncompromising intensity. They rigorously demanded absolute, flawless mechanical perfection, deeply knowing that their bravest, most elite combat pilots would soon be fiercely strapping themselves directly onto this highly experimental, deeply terrifying flying powder keg. The deeply exhausted engineers completely understood that any tiny, microscopic manufacturing flaw could instantly cause a catastrophic, fiery mid-air explosion over the harsh ocean. The monumental, spectacularly complex task of flawlessly routing the massive, highly pressurized aviation fuel lines around the terrifyingly hot British turbine block proved to be exceptionally difficult. The remarkably clever Australian engineering team actively had to heavily insulate the newly relocated, massive central fuel bladders using highly advanced, entirely experimental thermal shielding materials specifically for this dangerous project. They meticulously ensured that the incredibly volatile jet fuel absolutely would not prematurely detonate from the massive, radiant internal engine heat during flight. Integrating the massive, incredibly sophisticated new British electrical power generation systems alongside the vastly different, heavily modified American hydraulic flight control systems created an absolute logistical nightmare. The deeply frustrated technicians patiently spent countless, incredibly tedious hours meticulously splicing together thousands of highly complex, delicate sensory wires to seamlessly unite the wildly disparate international mechanical technologies. They brilliantly managed to forcefully synchronize the massive Avon engine's highly advanced electronic throttle controllers directly with the famously responsive, incredibly sensitive original flight stick. By the specific time the highly secretive, heavily modified initial prototype was finally ready to be carefully rolled completely out of the bustling manufacturing hangar, it had fundamentally transformed. The remarkably widened, highly distinctive front intake instantly gave the newly assembled aircraft a deeply menacing, incredibly aggressive visual profile that perfectly matched its vastly increased, utterly brutal lethality. The magnificent Avon Sabre was absolutely no longer simply just a standard, mass-produced North American F-86 built under a generic international license agreement. This astonishing, deeply terrifying new combat machine effectively possessed the raw, completely unbridled, thundering mechanical muscle of superior British jet propulsion engineering seamlessly merged with sweeping American aerodynamics. All of these wildly disparate, seemingly incompatible global technological elements were beautifully and brilliantly stitched completely together by pure, unadulterated, incredibly stubborn Australian industrial ingenuity and sheer force of national will. It was essentially a highly advanced, vastly superior interceptor long before major aerospace corporations had even officially coined that specific marketing term. The heavy financial cost of this unprecedented reconstructive surgery significantly exceeded the original, highly optimistic budget estimates previously presented to the deeply concerned government ministers. However, as the magnificent, gleaming silver fuselage of the very first operational prototype proudly caught the bright morning sunlight outside the massive factory doors, all financial anxieties completely vanished. The sheer, undeniable physical presence of the heavily modified interceptor brilliantly validated every single grueling, sleep-deprived hour the incredibly dedicated engineering team had forcefully endured. The incredibly proud, deeply exhausted engineers and brilliant mechanics standing closely on the busy, oil-stained factory floor silently looked up in absolute awe at the magnificent, brutally powerful creation. They had somehow managed to forcefully rewrite the rigid laws of aerodynamics and completely overcome supposedly impossible structural integration challenges through sheer, unwavering national determination and brilliant technical skill. The engineers at CAC had successfully performed the transplant. Now it was time to see if this monster could fly. By the specific time the very first extensively modified CA-27 Sabre prototype roared triumphantly off the scorching tarmac at Avalon Airfield in late 1953, the global aviation world instantly realized something profound. The fiercely determined Australians had absolutely not just built a mildly modified American fighter jet under a standard license. They had boldly created an entirely new, deeply terrifying class of high-altitude interceptor that fundamentally shattered existing performance paradigms. The immense, breathless anticipation among the gathered military officials quickly transformed into absolute, stunned silence. When the highly experienced, deeply focused test pilot aggressively pushed the heavy throttle lever fully forward, the massive new British mechanical heart immediately delivered on its monumental, breathtaking promise. The astonishingly powerful Rolls-Royce turbine unleashed a staggering 50% increase in raw, unadulterated thrust over the original, standard American power plant. The incredible, instantaneous aerodynamic results were absolutely undeniable and physically violent. The heavily modified aircraft completely defied gravity, instantly transforming the previously theoretical engineering calculations into a spectacular, roaring physical reality high above the clouds. The magnificent CAC Sabre absolutely did not just smoothly fly into the sky. It aggressively surged upward with the terrifying, explosive acceleration of an artillery shell. In the fiercely competitive, highly lethal world of sustained aerial dogfighting, raw kinetic energy is absolutely everything a combat pilot desperately needs to comfortably survive. Because the massively upgraded British engine was remarkably lighter yet vastly more powerful than the original American unit, the resulting hybrid fighter instantly possessed a completely unprecedented, utterly dominant thrust-to-weight ratio. This phenomenal, highly engineered power advantage completely left the standard, mass-produced United States-built fighters struggling pathetically in the dusty wake of the magnificent Australian machine. The deeply terrified, heavily compressed air screaming violently through the widened intake vividly signaled a profound, undeniable shift in global aerial superiority dynamics. The newly modified, roaring variant could effortlessly climb to 45,000 feet in nearly exactly half the precious time it typically took its much heavier, significantly slower original American structural counterpart to slowly ascend. For a highly trained combat pilot strapped tightly inside the incredibly cramped cockpit, this staggering, brutal vertical performance directly translated into an absolute, godlike ability to ruthlessly dictate the precise tactical terms of any hostile engagement. They could patiently, strategically hover high above the chaotic battlefield, actively choosing exactly when to violently dive into a swirling fight below. This incredibly aggressive, high-altitude tactical dominance firmly established the terrifying new aircraft as an undisputed, highly lethal apex predator within the fiercely contested modern skies. Crucially, the massive influx of raw British thrust gave the highly skilled Australian aviators the essential, desperately needed raw physical power to violently zoom climb completely away from sudden, unexpected aerial trouble. This specific, incredibly vital defensive maneuver was a highly complex, desperately dangerous feat that the standard, unmodified American fighter notoriously struggled to successfully execute against the remarkably lightweight, highly agile Soviet-built opponents over Korea. The brilliant engineering gamble had effectively produced a magical aerodynamic shield, fundamentally guaranteeing a massive, unprecedented tactical advantage. However, the absolute most terrifying, deeply visceral aerodynamic upgrade completely implemented by the relentlessly innovative technical team was undeniably not just the astonishing, neck-snapping forward speed. The true, unprecedented mechanical horror was the unimaginably brutal, utterly uncompromising offensive punch, secretly packed tightly inside the heavily reinforced nose section. The stubbornly traditional American military designers had cautiously stuck with their standard battery of 6 heavy machine guns, heavily relying entirely on a massive, continuous hail of small lead projectiles to slowly disable an enemy. The fiercely pragmatic, highly experienced Australian military strategists completely rejected this outdated, deeply flawed World War II tactical philosophy when aggressively planning their ultimate fighter. They intuitively knew that in the terrifyingly fast, incredibly chaotic modern jet age, a desperately maneuvering pilot might truly only ever get a tiny, fleeting fraction of a single second to accurately put their sophisticated targeting sights directly on a rapidly fleeing hostile target. Therefore, maximum, instant aerodynamic devastation was absolutely mandatory for reliable, consistent combat survival. To brilliantly solve this highly complex, desperately critical tactical equation, the fearsome CAC Sabre was aggressively armed with two massively destructive, incredibly heavy 30mm Aden automatic cannons. The sheer, terrifying, destructive potential of these massive, advanced British weapons completely altered the fundamental mathematical probabilities of high-altitude aerial combat engagements. A single, perfectly placed hit from just one massively explosive 30mm shell was frequently more than enough to instantly violently vaporize a solid wing spar or completely shatter a heavy, armored engine block. During the incredibly intense, highly classified live-fire testing trials secretly conducted over isolated ocean ranges, the terrifying reality of this massive, unprecedented firepower became brutally, immediately apparent. The incredibly violent, backward recoil generated by simultaneously firing these massive cannons was so intensely powerful that it initially caused deeply dangerous, massive structural fatigue cracks directly within the heavily modified forward nose assembly. The sheer, uncompromising brutality of the massive weapons fundamentally threatened to literally shake the magnificent, newly built aircraft completely to tiny pieces. This deeply terrifying, highly unexpected structural crisis instantly forced the brilliant, heavily exhausted engineering team urgently back to their brightly illuminated drafting tables in Melbourne. They rapidly, successfully solved the incredibly dangerous aerodynamic problem by meticulously reinforcing the entire forward fuselage section using remarkably thick, heavy-duty military skinning and highly complex internal bracing structures. This absolutely vital, incredibly difficult mechanical intervention officially turned the elegant, highly maneuverable Sabre from a rapidly stinging insect directly into an incredibly brutal, heavily armored flying sledgehammer. Elite, highly experienced United States Air Force exchange pilots who miraculously got the rare, highly coveted opportunity to sit behind the sensitive control stick of an operational Australian fighter were reportedly completely stunned. They breathlessly described the utterly terrifying, physically violent experience as essentially riding a heavily modified, completely unrestrained mechanical monster, completely hopped up on incredibly powerful aerodynamic steroids. The wildly enthusiastic American aviators quickly realized they were flying a profoundly superior, flawlessly engineered weapon that completely defied their previous tactical expectations. The stunned exchange officers repeatedly noted that the highly modified, incredibly powerful plane still handled with the exact same legendary aerodynamic sweetness as the original, heavily celebrated American Interceptor. However, it completely possessed a deeply terrifying, neck-snapping, instantaneous acceleration that fundamentally altered the physiological realities of sustained aerial combat maneuvering. The incredibly sensitive, remarkably balanced flight controls beautifully masked the brutal, raw violence constantly churning deeply within the massive, thundering British turbine tightly secured directly behind the heavily armored cockpit bulkhead. In strict terms of absolute, raw aerodynamic statistics, the brilliantly designed CAC aircraft pushed the foundational parameters of the classic swept-wing airframe perfectly to its absolute, unforgiving physical limit, while the standard, massively produced original American variant was strictly a highly capable subsonic aircraft that could genuinely only briefly break the sound barrier during a steep, desperately dangerous tactical dive. The heavily modified Australian hybrid was a completely different, vastly superior, terrifying beast. It possessed an incredibly dangerous, almost supernatural kinetic energy. The magnificent, incredibly powerful Avon-equipped version routinely flirted directly with the elusive, highly dangerous Mach 1 aerodynamic threshold, even while strictly maintaining completely level flight under certain precise atmospheric conditions. This staggering, unprecedented performance metric firmly ensured that the heavily modified Australian masterpiece permanently remained the absolute highest performing, most heavily armed tactical variant of the legendary Sabre family ever successfully produced by any nation. The brilliant engineering triumph completely silenced the loud, arrogant international critics who had initially mocked the audacious project. To the incredibly brave, highly skilled elite fighter pilots serving proudly within the ranks of the Royal Australian Air Force, this heavily modified aircraft was fundamentally much more than just a magnificent piece of military hardware. The terrifyingly powerful, perfectly balanced machine was an absolute, profound aerodynamic revelation that deeply changed their professional lives forever. While the original American design was already globally celebrated for its truly excellent, highly predictable handling characteristics, the aggressive Australian version added a completely new, terrifying dimension. The incredibly brilliant, fiercely dedicated local engineers had masterfully injected a terrifying, deep layer of raw, visceral, physical power that completely transformed the standard tactical flying experience into something incredibly dangerous and almost predatory. Stepping carefully down into the extremely tight, heavily instrumented cockpit, an anxious pilot was immediately greeted by the highly familiar, exceptionally ergonomic mechanical layout of the highly successful original North American design. But the precise, terrifying moment the massive British engine was completely ignited, the profound difference became brutally clear. The massively powerful, highly advanced Rolls-Royce turbine absolutely did not just smoothly hum like a standard, conventional American power plant. It continuously delivered a terrifying, highly characteristic low-frequency mechanical growl. This deeply unsettling, incredibly powerful violent vibration strongly resonated directly through the heavy armored seat, physically warning the strapped-in pilot of the immense, utterly unrestrained explosive violence patiently waiting to be rapidly unleashed. On a short, combat-loaded takeoff roll, the sudden forward acceleration was so intensely brisk it was often completely terrifying. Many highly experienced, seasoned combat pilots who were completely accustomed to the expected, inherent aerodynamic sluggishness of significantly earlier jet designs were frequently caught completely off guard by how incredibly quickly the critical rotational speeds were aggressively met. The terrifying, incredibly powerful hybrid interceptor absolutely did not ever require a long, desperate, painfully slow run heavily down the blistering concrete runway. It violently, aggressively leaped directly into the air, absolutely hungry for massive altitude and instantly searching for an aerial fight. High up in the freezing, thin atmospheric air, the incredibly heavy, massively modified aircraft was universally described by awestruck aviators as being beautifully, flawlessly harmonious in its complex, high-speed aerodynamic movements. The brilliant technical team had meticulously, patiently balanced the massive increased dead weight of the devastatingly heavy cannons with a newly modified, highly sensitive hydraulic boost system specifically designed for the delicate flight controls. The final, spectacular aerodynamic result was a heavy fighter that instantly responded to the absolute lightest physical touch. Overwhelmed pilots frequently, enthusiastically remarked in classified debriefings that the magnificent aircraft genuinely felt significantly less like a massive, heavy external mechanical machine and profoundly more like a direct, highly sensitive physical extension of their very own bodies. In a brutal, incredibly dangerous swirling dogfight where massive gravitational loading and instantaneous structural turn rates absolutely dictate exactly who lives and who ultimately dies, the modified aircraft was an absolute dream. The massively increased thrust directly allowed pilots to maintain exceptionally high kinetic energy levels. This critical, unprecedented power advantage effectively meant they could relentlessly stay glued directly onto a desperately fleeing opponent's tail section long after an unmodified, standard American variant would have completely bled off its vital airspeed and tragically fallen out of the sky. The incredibly stubborn, wildly ambitious Australian engineers had successfully created a magnificent, deeply terrifying mechanical monster that completely dominated the tactical battle space. The Americans had originally provided the excellent structural skeleton, but the highly innovative Australians had fundamentally provided the lethal muscle. For a brief, incredibly shining, historically significant moment throughout the rapidly evolving mid-1950s, a relatively small, highly dedicated factory operating in Melbourne was aggressively producing the absolute finest tactical air superiority fighter anywhere in the entire Western world. This magnificent, deeply undeniable technical achievement forcefully proved that when it genuinely came to advanced, highly complex aerospace engineering, the fiercely proud Australians absolutely did not just quietly follow the established global leader. They completely, dramatically overshot them in terms of raw capability. Even as significantly newer, vastly faster supersonic jet designs slowly began to ominously appear on the distant technological horizon, the brave men who proudly flew the incredible Australian interceptor always looked at their terrifying mounts with a fierce, highly protective national pride. They deeply, fundamentally knew They were incredibly privileged to be actively flying the absolute ultimate, most lethal physical expression of a highly celebrated, classic global aviation design. They commanded an unstoppable, brilliantly engineered mechanical predator that fundamentally rewrote the tactical rulebook. As the massive, thundering engines were finally shut down after grueling test flights, the scorching hot metal slowly pinged and loudly settled on the quiet tarmac, signaling the total, undeniable completion of an incredibly historic, magnificent aviation triumph. The brilliant mechanics proudly wiped their oily hands, intensely staring at the deeply menacing, heavily armed silhouette perfectly resting against the darkening sky. It was a bird that looked like an American, sang like a Brit, but fought with the unmistakable, uncompromising spirit of Australia. While the magnificent CAC Sabre was originally born out of a fierce desire for national engineering excellence, its true combat test eventually came in the sweltering, incredibly humid skies of Southeast Asia. By the late 1950s and the volatile early 1960s, the terrifying Cold War was rapidly heating up throughout the entire Pacific theater. Australia suddenly found itself thrust directly onto the highly dangerous front line of vital regional stability. The heavily armed Australian interceptor would soon face an unprecedented strategic challenge. The deeply menacing, heavily modified Avon Sabre rapidly became the absolute primary tactical tool of aggressive Australian diplomacy and vital regional deterrence. Dozens of these remarkably powerful, superbly engineered interceptors were strategically stationed directly at RAAF Butterworth in tropical Malaya and later at the highly active Ubon base in Thailand. In these incredibly harsh, deeply unpredictable tropical theaters, the fiercely proud Australian-engineered fighter would forcefully earn the extremely wary respect of both close international allies and fiercely determined potential ideological adversaries. During the brutal, heavily protracted Malayan emergency and the extremely tense subsequent Indonesian confrontation, the highly visible tactical presence of RAAF Sabres aggressively acted as a massively powerful regional force multiplier. Although these magnificent, heavily armed aircraft were fundamentally designed primarily as high-altitude interceptors, they were brilliantly adapted for highly dangerous, low-level ground attack roles. They aggressively strafed hidden insurgent jungle camps using their devastating, incredibly powerful 30mm automatic cannons, delivering absolute, terrifying mechanical destruction directly onto deeply concealed hostile jungle positions. However, it was strictly within the highly demanding, utterly unforgiving air-to-air combat arena that these magnificent Australian hybrid interceptors truly demonstrated their absolute aerodynamic dominance. Strategically stationed just a tiny tactical stone's throw directly away from highly contested Indonesian territorial airspace, the elite RAAF pilots frequently found themselves locked in tense, incredibly dangerous shadowboxing matches. They regularly aggressively intercepted and directly challenged heavily armed Indonesian MiGs during highly classified, desperately tense border patrols that threatened to violently ignite a massive regional war. The beautifully engineered Avon Sabre's vastly superior vertical climb rate and exceptional high-altitude aerodynamic performance effectively meant that the confident RAAF squadrons could always maintain an incredibly dominant, top tactical cover. This highly aggressive, perfectly executed vertical positioning was practically impossible for the deeply frustrated Indonesian fighter pilots to safely bypass or successfully counter. This heavily armed, constant aerial presence effectively, aggressively discouraged any foolish attempts at a full-scale regional aerial escalation, firmly maintaining a highly tense but undeniably stable international peace. One of the absolutely most fascinating, profoundly historic chapters of the entire magnificent CAC Sabre story spectacularly took place at Ubon Air Base in Thailand during the deeply turbulent mid-1960s, as the devastating, highly controversial Vietnam War began to violently intensify across the troubled border. The RAAF aggressively deployed No. 79 Squadron to forcefully defend Thai airspace against any potential hostile incursions. Here, the highly experienced Australian aviators would directly interact with the absolute cutting edge of the American military machine. It was a profoundly surreal, deeply striking visual sight constantly witnessed on the scorching tropical concrete flight lines. The gently aging but incredibly refined, superbly maintained Australian Sabres were proudly parked directly on the exact same crowded tarmac as the massive, incredibly advanced supersonic American F-4 Phantoms. Alongside them sat the heavily armored, brutally powerful F-105 Thunder Chiefs. This spectacular, highly contrasting mechanical lineup perfectly showcased two completely different, radically opposed eras of military aviation philosophy, silently standing shoulder to shoulder waiting for war. The highly confident, fiercely proud American tactical fighter pilots were initially deeply dismissive of what they arrogantly viewed as merely a heavily outdated, incredibly obsolete Korean War-era mechanical relic. They loudly boasted about the massive, raw supersonic speed and incredibly complex, highly advanced radar-guided missile systems packed inside their gigantic, heavy modern jets. The visiting American aviators genuinely believed that the relatively tiny, visibly older swept-wing Australian fighters simply possessed absolutely no tactical relevance whatsoever on a highly advanced modern aerial battlefield. However, the famously humble but fiercely competitive Australian pilots merely smiled politely at the loud American boasting, quietly knowing the terrifying, hidden power resting silently within their magnificent British engines. They patiently waited for the highly anticipated, heavily structured joint international training exercises to finally commence in the humid skies above the dense jungle canopy. The incredibly shocked American Air Force exchange officers soon had their highly skeptical eyes violently blown completely open by the stunning, utterly undeniable reality of combat physics. In these incredibly intense, brutally realistic mock aerial combat scenarios, the highly skilled RAAF pilots aggressively used the heavily modified Avon Sabre's terrifying agility to thoroughly embarrass the vastly faster American jets. They violently dragged the massive, incredibly heavy supersonic interceptors directly into the deeply unforgiving, desperately tight, swirling, twisting dogfights commonly referred to as the telephone booth. In this deeply intimate, fiercely violent, close-in combat arena, raw top speed was utterly completely useless. Without the crucial ability to turn tightly and sharply, the incredibly massive, technologically advanced American Phantoms critically lacked any internal automatic cannons at that specific historical time, completely relying entirely on early-generation air-to-air missiles. Furthermore, these heavily loaded, massive aerodynamic behemoths suffered from deeply atrocious, practically fatal maneuverability characteristics at lower tactical airspeeds. Consequently, the highly embarrassed American aviators were repeatedly, ruthlessly gunned down by the incredibly nimble, fiercely aggressive Australian Sabres during completely simulated but intensely competitive, highly aggressive turning engagements high above the sweltering, dense Thai jungle canopy. The brilliantly trained, highly aggressive Australian pilots perfectly leveraged the massive Avon engine's terrifyingly instantaneous throttle response to deliberately lure the heavy, sluggish American jets into deeply fatal tactical energy traps. They would aggressively force the massive Phantoms to completely bleed off their vital kinetic energy in desperately tight turns, instantly rendering them totally defenseless hovering targets. The magnificent Australian hybrid violently proved that having massive, unstoppable straight-line acceleration absolutely guarantees nothing if you physically cannot bring your formidable weapons precisely to bear. These deeply humiliating, highly classified tactical defeats severely shocked the heavily bruised egos of the highly decorated American fighter squadrons deployed across the massive tropical base. The older, masterfully engineered Australian fighter jets undeniably demonstrated a timeless, fundamentally brutal aerodynamic truth that the technologically obsessed Americans had foolishly forgotten. They violently proved that in a terrifying, deeply chaotic dogfight, a brilliantly sharp tactical knife firmly held in the highly experienced hands of an absolute master is substantially more dangerous than a clumsy broadsword. Furthermore, the relentlessly innovative Australian technical teams introduced yet another massive, deeply terrifying tactical innovation to their aggressively upgraded interceptors throughout the deeply volatile early 1960s. By brilliantly engineering the complex physical integration of the highly advanced American AIM-9 Sidewinder heat-seeking missile directly onto the Avon Sabre's delicate wings, the RAAF created a truly lethal, completely unprecedented tactical hybrid. This highly complex, incredibly dangerous weapon upgrade forcefully bridged the massive technological gap between two completely different, distinctly separate generations of aerial warfare. This completely unprecedented, incredibly lethal technological marriage spectacularly resulted in a magnificent fighter jet, absolutely possessing the incredibly tight, devastating turning circle of a classic dogfighter. Crucially, it simultaneously possessed the terrifying, deeply lethal fire-and-forget standoff capability defining the highly advanced modern missile age. This incredibly potent, massively destructive aerodynamic combination immediately allowed the aging but highly refined Sabre to powerfully remain a deeply credible, absolutely terrifying aerial threat, even against significantly faster, massively heavier Mach 2 capable hostile aircraft designs. The fiercely proud, deeply professional Australian pilots of No. 79 Squadron were frequently and affectionately referred to as the legendary U-Bahn Ghosts by their deeply impressed international counterparts. They diligently, silently patrolled the highly dangerous, heavily contested airspace, acting as an incredibly reliable, fiercely protective tactical shield covering the massive Allied base. Although they never actually saw direct, officially recorded air-to-air combat against heavily armed North Vietnamese MiGs, their deeply menacing, heavily armed physical presence served as a massive, utterly vital regional deterrent. These beautifully maintained, powerfully armed Australian interceptors reliably provided a massively strong, completely unshakable defensive backstop for the highly stressed, deeply exhausted American tactical bomber wings. By fiercely securing the highly vulnerable immediate airspace completely surrounding the massive Thai base, the Australian pilots directly allowed the massive U.S. strike packages to totally focus on their incredibly dangerous bombing missions over Vietnam. The brilliant Australian engineering triumph effectively became a highly trusted, absolutely essential tactical guardian deeply embedded within a massively complex international war. The magnificent CAC Sabre's prolonged, highly demanding operational service throughout the deeply hostile environments of Southeast Asia fundamentally represented an absolute masterclass in mechanical reliability. While the incredibly sophisticated, highly complex American supersonic jets constantly struggled with massive, cascading electronic failures caused by the highly corrosive tropical salt air and deeply oppressive humidity, the older aircraft thrived. The aggressively rugged, heavily over-engineered Australian Sabres continuously maintained incredibly high, practically miraculous daily mission readiness rates that deeply astounded American logistical commanders. These highly robust, flawlessly constructed Australian machines were the incredibly silent, deeply reliable mechanical sentinels constantly standing guard under the absolutely brutal, scorching tropical sun. They spectacularly proved that brilliant Australian aerospace engineering wasn't solely focused on achieving raw, terrifying aerodynamic power and massive offensive destruction. The incredibly grueling overseas deployment completely validated that true engineering mastery also fundamentally requires absolute, unwavering mechanical durability and extreme operational resilience when continuously deployed in the absolute toughest, most unforgiving physical environments on Earth. The deeply humbled American fighter pilots eventually developed a massive, profound tactical respect for both the fiercely aggressive Australian aviators and their wildly impressive, heavily modified mechanical mounts. A highly decorated American combat veteran once famously noted that if he absolutely had to merge into a deeply terrifying, swirling visual dogfight, he desperately prayed an Avon Sabre was securely guarding his vulnerable wing. The magnificent Australian hybrid had completely shattered all prior technological assumptions, aggressively commanding absolute respect through undeniable aerodynamic dominance. The incredible, highly successful Southeast Asian deployment marked the absolute operational zenith of the magnificent CAC Sabre's glorious, deeply celebrated military service record. The incredibly brave Australian pilots deeply knew they were actively flying an absolute, undeniably classic masterpiece that had beautifully pushed conventional physical boundaries to their very breaking point. The brilliantly engineered machine had reliably kept them incredibly safe, flawlessly executing every single highly demanding, desperately dangerous tactical maneuver they ever asked of its thundering, massively powerful British heart. However, the incredibly relentless, deeply unforgiving march of rapid technological progress firmly indicated that the highly celebrated era of the pure, subsonic turning dogfighter was finally drawing close. The fiercely proud Australian aviators heavily prepared to ultimately hand over the highly contested tactical skies to a completely new, massively faster generation of delta-winged supersonic interceptors. Yet, their magnificent achievements against massively superior foes deeply resonated. They brilliantly proved that in a dogfight, a sharp knife in the hands of a master is more dangerous than a heavy broadsword. By the incredibly late 1960s, the fiercely competitive global world of military aviation was aggressively moving at a terrifying, deeply unprecedented technological pace. This relentless, highly aggressive industrial acceleration seemed to effortlessly break the restrictive sound barrier every single alternating year with massive, highly advanced aerospace designs. The highly anticipated, deeply spectacular arrival of the formidable American Century Series fighters and the incredibly sleek, French-built Mirage III fundamentally shifted the entire aerodynamic paradigm. These massively powerful, highly sophisticated delta-winged interceptors were easily capable of sustaining phenomenal, deeply terrifying Mach 2 supersonic speeds during high-altitude combat. This spectacular, highly aggressive technological leap forward definitively signaled to the entire global defense community that the glorious, deeply celebrated era of the pure subsonic dogfighter was rapidly drawing to a definitive close. Despite its incredible, massively powerful British Avon heart and its terrifyingly destructive 30mm explosive claws, the magnificent CAC Sabre was finally beginning to show its undeniable mechanical age. The remarkably fast, incredibly high-flying delta-winged interceptors now aggressively ruled the vast, deeply contested international skies with absolute, unmatched aerodynamic authority. A completely new, massively different tactical philosophy, fundamentally prioritizing beyond visual range missile engagements, had officially arrived. Consequently, the highly pragmatic leadership within the Royal Australian Air Force reluctantly began the incredibly complex, massively expensive logistical transition to the sleek, needle-nosed Mirage. The deeply beloved, heavily modified Avon Sabres were gradually, incredibly respectfully withdrawn from their highly active, profoundly dangerous frontline combat service across the volatile Southeast Asian theater. The fiercely proud, highly experienced Australian aviators deeply mourned the inevitable loss of their incredibly nimble, fiercely reliable mechanical mounts. However, the deeply fascinating, profoundly historic story of the brilliantly engineered Australian interceptor absolutely did not simply end in a forgotten, rusting scrap heap. In a truly brilliant, highly strategic move of international aviation diplomacy, the forward-thinking Australian government boldly decided to purposefully utilize these still formidable, incredibly lethal machines. They aggressively sought to actively strengthen vital regional security alliances by generously redeploying the heavily armed interceptors to deeply trusted, highly valued neighboring allies. Between 1969 and 1978, dozens of meticulously refurbished, brilliantly maintained CAC Sabres were officially, proudly gifted directly to the actively expanding Royal Malaysian Air Force and the highly ambitious Indonesian Air Force. This massive, incredibly generous military transfer fundamentally altered the entire regional balance of tactical aerodynamic power. For these developing, deeply vulnerable Southeast Asian nations, this spectacular, highly unexpected military gift was absolutely, profoundly transformative on a massive national scale. The beautifully engineered, fiercely reliable CAC Sabre instantly became the heavily armed, completely unshakable cornerstone of their deeply expanding, highly modernized national air defense networks. This incredibly powerful, heavily upgraded Australian interceptor forcefully provided an unprecedented, deeply intimidating level of technological sophistication and massive offensive firepower. These vital, highly advanced aerodynamic capabilities were something that these rapidly growing regional military forces genuinely could not have otherwise realistically afforded or successfully acquired during that volatile era. To strictly ensure the continued, highly successful operational deployment of these massive, heavily modified tactical machines, dedicated Australian technicians and highly experienced combat pilots generously stayed behind. They patiently, meticulously trained their international neighbors, effectively fostering a deeply unique, incredibly powerful military mateship of the vast tropical skies. This vital, highly classified international cooperation actively helped successfully stabilize the deeply fractured, highly volatile Southeast Asian geopolitical landscape during some of its absolute most turbulent, incredibly dangerous historical decades. The brilliant Australian engineering triumph completely transcended its original defensive purpose, effectively becoming a massive instrument of enduring regional peace. The profoundly enduring, deeply celebrated historical legacy of the magnificent CAC saber firmly stands as a towering, absolutely undeniable testament to a highly ambitious national period. It perfectly represents a thrilling, highly courageous era when a rapidly developing Australia boldly dared to forcefully be significantly more than just a massive, incredibly wealthy financial customer of the established global superpowers. It proudly remains the absolute most successful, profoundly impactful domestic jet fighter manufacturing program in the entire deeply storied, highly celebrated history of the proud Australian nation. The fiercely determined engineers completely redefined exactly what their ambitious country could physically achieve. While the massively produced, highly celebrated original North American F-86 is universally fondly remembered by global historians as a truly magnificent, perfectly balanced classic aerodynamic design, the heavily modified Australian variant occupies a distinctly superior, fiercely independent historical tier. The deeply terrifying, massively upgraded CAC CA-27 is rightfully universally remembered by highly educated aerospace experts as an absolute, uncompromising mechanical masterpiece. It brilliantly, violently proved that a highly motivated, incredibly resourceful, medium-sized global power could aggressively take an already world-class structural design and radically transform its fundamental capabilities. They essentially possessed the sheer audacity to rewrite the aerodynamic rules. Through pure, unadulterated engineering grit and massively uncompromising national determination, the brilliant Australian manufacturing team successfully made a legendary fighter jet significantly better, massively faster, and fundamentally deadlier in every conceivable metric. Today, if you deeply respectfully visit the incredibly quiet, highly reverent halls of the RAAF Museum located at Point Cook, or the meticulously maintained Aviation Heritage Center situated at Temora, you might witness something profoundly magical. You can still visibly see one of the absolute very few remaining, beautifully restored Avon sabers actively maintained in flawless, completely airworthy mechanical condition specifically for rare, highly anticipated public flight demonstrations. When the massively powerful, incredibly complex British engine officially starts on the blistering concrete tarmac, that deeply terrifying, highly characteristic low guttural mechanical growl violently erupts. The massive, deeply resonating vibration of the mighty Rolls-Royce Avon still forcefully sends massive, uncontrollable physical shivers directly down the spines of those deeply educated historians who intimately know its terrifying, highly lethal combat history. It absolutely does not sound like a smooth, highly refined modern supersonic jet gently humming its highly computerized internal systems. It forcefully sounds exactly like a brutal, heavily armored mechanical predator actively hunting from a completely forgotten golden age. The brilliant, profoundly inspiring narrative surrounding the fiercely independent CAC Sabre project actively provides the absolute ultimate, deeply resounding historical answer to a highly complex, deeply debated national question. It aggressively, undeniably demonstrates exactly why any sovereign, highly ambitious country should heavily, consistently invest deep financial resources directly into completely cultivating its very own advanced domestic engineering capabilities. The wildly successful, heavily classified project meticulously taught the deeply enthusiastic, rapidly growing Australian aerospace industry exactly how to successfully integrate massively complex, deeply incompatible international mechanical systems. It forcefully paved the massive, highly critical foundational way for entirely new technological generations. Furthermore, this monumental, deeply historic aviation triumph systematically instructed the heavily exhausted, fiercely dedicated local engineers exactly how to violently redesign highly complex, immensely stressed internal structural airframes without suffering catastrophic aerodynamic failure. They beautifully, flawlessly learned exactly how to aggressively push the deeply unforgiving, strictly rigid physical limits of theoretical aerodynamics completely past the firmly established edge of the known scientific envelope. It spectacularly, violently proved that in the incredibly high-stakes, deeply lethal, strictly unforgiving global game of modern aerial warfare, pure technical innovation deeply matters. True, absolute dominance ultimately requires incredibly daring, highly unconventional structural leaps. The highly secretive, spectacularly successful Melbourne production lines fundamentally showcased that a tiny, incredibly potent spark of sheer, highly aggressive Aussie ingenuity could violently alter global expectations. The fiercely stubborn, brilliantly capable mechanical teams boldly proved they could easily take an already legendary, massively celebrated American airframe and aggressively turn it completely into an absolutely terrifying, genuinely undisputed international world beater. This magnificently engineered, massively powerful hybrid interceptor actively commanded deep, unshakable respect across deeply contested international skies, forcefully silencing any arrogant international critics who foolishly doubted the immense raw capability of the incredibly determined Southern workforce. Ultimately, the massive, highly complex industrial reality of the entire deeply ambitious project was a beautifully orchestrated, highly dangerous international symphony of purely devastating mechanical power. The deeply experienced, heavily resourced Americans may have originally provided the excellent structural skeleton and the brilliant initial conceptual spark for the massively successful interceptor. Simultaneously, the incredibly sophisticated, highly advanced British aerospace industry certainly provided the massive, terrifyingly explosive mechanical fuel required to effortlessly conquer the freezing, highly contested upper atmosphere. However, it was strictly the fiercely determined, brilliantly innovative Australians who aggressively forged the actual, terrifyingly destructive physical flame of absolute victory. The magnificently powerful, deeply revered Avon Sabre permanently remains an absolutely towering, highly unshakable historical symbol of a profoundly glorious, incredibly ambitious national era. It perfectly encapsulates a highly dynamic time when the traditionally overlooked junior geopolitical partner, hailing strictly from the distant South Pacific, definitively refused to quietly follow the established, highly dominant global leaders. They absolutely did not just politely join the massively competitive, fiercely dangerous international military aerospace race. Through pure, deeply uncompromising engineering brilliance and sheer national grit, the fiercely proud Australians aggressively took the definitive lead, leaving a massive, permanently enduring aerodynamic masterpiece behind.